Good evening. I'm Bob Hauser, Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to this virtual lecture at the Society. I'm glad you've joined us. Even in this virtual environment, I want to acknowledge that the Society's home rests on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. They are still among us. We honor their community and those of other Native peoples through our collections, fellowships, research awards, and outreach activities. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge. Most of our nation's founders were members, and the APS had Thomas Jefferson as its president for 17 years, during most of which he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like the Constitution, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the Society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our new nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. The Society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing more than $1 million of research grants and fellowships each year, primarily to younger scholars who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. It is of particular relevance to this evening's presentation that the APS has recently created the David Center for the American Revolution, which will increase our capacity for research, education, and public outreach. The Society sustains and informs citizenry. We do that through our meetings, influencing the influencers, and other events like this one. Although our facilities are now closed to the public, we remain committed to serving our mission of promoting useful knowledge through virtual programming like this evening's lecture. Please check our website, www.amphilsoc.org, both for our traditional offerings and for news of forthcoming events, virtual now, and when it is safe, live and in person. The main event this evening will be a conversation with Gaye Wilson about her recent book, Jefferson on Display, Attire, Etiquette, and the Art of Presentation. Those of you who have joined us previously at Franklin Hall will know the last great portrait done in life of Thomas Jefferson, begun in 1821 and finished in 1824 by Thomas Sully, which is mounted at the front of the auditorium. As with any portrait, Sully's is ultimately defined by creator, subject, and viewer, a topic for our discussion this evening, I expect. While we at the Society continue to admire Jefferson for his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, for his leadership of the Society and of the nation, and for his devotion to science, architecture, and education, we are also very much aware of his faults, and most importantly, his inconsistent and as now seen hypocritical combination of political efforts to limit the slave trade with a lifetime of slaveholding and the fathering of numerous unacknowledged children with his late wife's enslaved half-sister, Sally Hemings. I'm going to leave the introduction of Gaye Wilson to someone who knows the art of portraiture far better than me, to put the matter mildly. I came close to flunking my 8th grade art class and still have limited skill with stick figures. On the other hand, John Friedman is probably the leading portrait artist in the United States. In 2016, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society, which recognized him as a painter of striking portraits that creatively capture the personality and life work of the person. Raised in Arlington, Virginia, Friedman received a BA in philosophy from Princeton University and an MFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. He also studied at the Corcoran Museum School in Washington, D.C., and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine. Friedman's portraits, landscape paintings, and sculptures have been shown in exhibitions throughout the United States and indeed throughout the world. His portrait work is represented in numerous public and institutional collections here and abroad, including the National Portrait Gallery, the U.S. House of Representatives, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Institutes of Health, the Federal Reserve Board, and many, many others. He's contributed more than a dozen portraits of APS members to the Society, most of which now appear on the first floor of Franklin Hall. This members gallery includes a portrait of his father, pioneering astrophysicist and public servant, Herbert Friedman. But I'm going to share three of my personal favorites, and I would note that two of these folks are here with us this evening. The first is Judge David Tatel. The second, who is not here with us this evening, Herman Goldstein, the developer of one of the first computers, the ENIAC, and that portrait, which I just love, hangs in my office at Philosophical Hall. Whoops. And last, my friend Bruce Alberts. This depicts him as president of the National Academy of Sciences with the wonderful double helix staircase in the Keck Center behind him. And with that, I welcome John Friedman to the virtual stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Bob. It's my pleasure now to introduce Gaye Wilson. Gaye is a senior fellow with the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies, which is the academic branch of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello. Over the past 25 years, Gaye has researched, written, and published on Jefferson and his role in the founding of the early American Republic, presenting her work both nationally and internationally. Gaye received a Master of Fine Arts degree in theater art and costume design from the University of Texas at Austin, where she worked as a costume designer and taught history of clothing in the theater department before moving on to get a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh. Her historical scholarship and her deep hands-on knowledge and understanding of the material culture of clothing and costume have come together in her 2018 book, Jefferson on Display, Attire, Etiquette, and the Art of Presentation. In this book, Gaye examines how Jefferson fashioned his evolving public persona, polished cosmopolitan diplomat, professional public servant, rough-hewn representative of the common people, anti-federalist opponent of monarchy and oligarchy, and founding father, to promote his political agenda during a divisive and turbulent period of the early republic. Her detailed analysis of Jefferson's social practice and his portraits provide new insights into how he used his public demeanor and his representation in paintings and prints to convey political messages to the electorate and to shape how he wished to be remembered. Please welcome Gaye Wilson and Patrick Spiro, the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, in conversation about Jefferson on Display. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for such a wonderful introduction. And it's an honor to be at the American Philosophical Society, and also quite an honor to be introduced by you. I'm quite a fan of portraits and such an illustrious portrait painter. I mean, this is it's quite an evening, quite exciting. Hi, Patrick.
Hi, Gaye. It's great to see you. And I want to welcome everybody as well to our conversation, our virtual conversation. Gaye, I wish this was happening in person, but it's great to have you here this way. One thing I want to add for all those that are tuning in from their homes, we really encourage questions. Please ask us questions at any point during my conversation with Gaye. I can see them come in real time, and I can ask them then. And also, we've carved out some time at the end of my conversation with Gaye to also ask questions from the audience. To do that through Zoom is please use the Q&A feature. It's either at the top or bottom of your screen, but there's a Q&A feature. Ask that question, and we will be able to ask many of our questions of Gaye when the time comes. It's okay, it's great to have you here. And here is the book that you recently published that I found just absolutely fascinating. I learned so much about Jefferson, but also the way that Jefferson's been depicted over time. And in many ways, this is a conversation that you and I began in person last summer when I was at Monticello, and talked about all the research that you had done. And I was beginning to delve into early American art and art history, which was a totally foreign field to me. I studied political history, and I learned so much from this book. It's been so helpful. And one of the things that we talked a lot about was I was exploring John Trumbull, who was a leading painter in early America, but he did history paintings. And one of the things that your book does is look at a lot of portraitures. And one of the real takeaways I had was a point you made early on in the book. In the 18th century, the role of history painting and portraiture, especially portraiture, was shifting a little bit. For much of the period, history paintings of historic scenes that could educate the public, those were for public consumption, those were for education. But in the 18th century, increasingly, portraits began to serve a more public role. And you saw that with Charles Willson Peale's museum that he opened in Philadelphia. But you also see it in Jefferson, both as somebody that sat for portraits, but was himself a portrait collector. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that transition that you saw happening.
Well, certainly portraits, of course, not new, and they were a very popular format, especially in the colonies, and they could be used, in various ways. A portrait could be within the family. It's marking a very historic event for the family, like whether it was a marriage, whether it was maybe a death, maybe a birth, things of this sort. But yes, I think then with the New Republic, they began to expand out. They began to be used in a different way. And as you mentioned, Charles Willson Peale certainly began even during the Revolution to take those little quick sketches of some of the military, the Continental Army men and officers. And this, of course, grew and grew until he then had his gallery there in Philadelphia. Now, when I first see Jefferson, now he had a wish list, but when he really actively began trying to collect portraits was when he was ready to leave for Paris as to be the US Minister Plenipotentiary at the court in Versailles. And that's when he very actively began to engage in creating and acquiring portraits for himself. Because the portrait could tell you, it could mark, yes, you've got the face of a person there, but it could mark a specific association of what had this person done, why do we want to see them. And so you get a little bit of a history lesson right there in looking at these people, and men is what we were seeing at that time. Always a little propaganda attached to this when you have a memorial. And of course, that's one reason I think we wanted to talk about it today, because this idea of memorials, it's something we're really questioning ourselves on now, of what shouldn't be, and what is more appropriate. So certainly in the 18th century, as we're saying, This began to be something that was accumulated. Jefferson referred to his collection of American worthies, and it had a very definite purpose. And so he's getting ready to leave for Paris when he says, I must have a copy of a portrait of George Washington. And so he collects that, he takes it on to Paris. There he obtains one of Benjamin Franklin. These were painted portraits, but then also from the French sculptor Hutong, he does manage to acquire then a John Paul Jones, later a Lafayette. So he adds these sculpted bust portraits as well. But he's building this collection, and I should say that when he's in Paris, his residence also becomes the American legation. So he has this collection of American worthies up on the walls. We don't know exactly how they were all displayed. The only one he mentions is the Washington was in the dining room, but of course a very prestigious place to be where many important people were going to see him. But this collection is displayed there. And I don't think it would be lost on anyone coming into the American legation of who they were seeing. And if not, didn't know, possibly pointed out to them, because these were the faces of the men who had somehow secured independence, who were now active in trying to form this American Republic. And so you had a little history lesson there. And also I should add that to these known faces that had taken part in the American cause, then as that began to grow, he began to add some of the Enlightenment thinkers that had contributed in the thought that was picked up that led to American independence and revolution and independence. And then to that, he even added some of the world explorers who had first, Europeans, of course, who had first come in contact with North America. So you go in and you get a little history lesson there. You also get a little propaganda by saying, okay, look at us. We did this. We are going to succeed, because he was also very aware, as were the rest of them, this great experiment, as they like to call it, that most of Europe was just waiting for it to implode in upon itself. I mean, come on, we didn't have a king, we didn't have a prince, we had George Washington, but I mean, it was doubtful to many at that point that this young upstart republic was going to be able to make it. So I think that's one thing Jefferson was trying to do, to say, see, look at us, look at who was involved and what we did, and we are going to move forward. So I think that was a bit of the purpose in his own personal collection and what he was trying to do. Of course, that collection came back with him to the United States, first to Philadelphia, then on to Monticello, where much of it still is today. So important collection for us.
Yeah. No, and it was a fascinating window on Jefferson. I'd never really thought about it that way. I was unaware of how he used this public area, these portraits in this public area, to kind of project American power in history and offer an interpretation of history. Where was he acquiring this material while he was in Paris?
From different sources. The copy of and many of them were copies. They were not all original portraits. Many were copies, but that was fine, because that still served his purpose. Like the Benjamin Franklin, if we had it up, a lot of people would recognize it's from the famous Duplessis portrait of Franklin, the one with the red suit with the fur collar on. But Jefferson purchased a copy from Jean Ballade. I think that John Paul Jones, actually Jones presented him with the bust portrait that Hutong had done of John Paul Jones. Then he was instrumental in getting the portrait of Lafayette commissioned and done, and so he had a copy for himself. So they came from various sources, but the biggest, like I say, he got the Washington before he left Philadelphia. It was by Joseph Wright of Philadelphia, and it had it finished by your guy when he gets to Trumbull, when he gets to Paris. But then most of the others he did acquire when he was in Paris. Some he ordered from the Uffizi, some from the Royal Society in London, but then he would have copies made. But as I say, that wasn't so important that it was original a copy. It was the story that they could tell, the story he could put together. Now, he did commission the one of John Adams, and that was commissioned when he was in London, and commissioned his own portrait by Mather Brown.
Well, that's a great segue, because I was hoping you might be able to tell us a bit about the story that, if I can figure out how to do, there we go, the story that this portrait tells us, which is commissioned, done by Mather Brown, while Jefferson was stationed in Paris, but he's traveled to London. He's still on friendly terms with John Adams, and they both have their portraits painted. And I just loved your reading of this. This is an image of Jefferson that looks so different from what we're used to when we think about the portraits that come much later. And so I didn't know if you could just, as an audience, show us the work that art historians do and just give us a reading of what this tells you.
Okay, I'm going to hit some of the high points. But yes, this was, as far as we know, it's the first extant, the earliest extant portrait of Jefferson that is we still have today. This was actually the copy that wound up in the Adams family, and it's now in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington. But when Jefferson, he was in London, yes, he was there to meet with John Adams on various matters. And this is when he had this young American, Mather Brown. He commissioned his own portrait, which is the one you're seeing here. And then, like I say, a companion portrait of Adams. And it was Adams that he said, I must have this for my collection of American worthies. He didn't mention his portrait, so we're not sure what he had in mind for it, but we do know what he intended for the Adams. But a few things to point out in this. I think, yes, Jefferson looks very different to us here. He's looking quite European. He's looking quite French, as a matter of fact. If we had the Adams up beside him, we'd go, yeah, he looks a little different. Hair is a little bit more formally dressed. And by the way, I do think it was his hair, not a wig. I can't find any evidence that he purchased wigs when he was in Paris, but he paid a lot of money for hairdressing, for the powder or the pomatum. He paid his valet.
That's one of the questions that just came in. Somebody asked
really?
that very question, yeah.
Okay, then here we are. So I do not feel he was actually wearing a wig. But then, of course, for his appearances in the French court, which would have been on Diplomatic Tuesdays, he was expected to have the hair very formally and appropriately dressed. So obviously he does. And also then there's a wonderful remark by Abigail Adams. She's writing to her family in New England, and she and Jefferson really became very good friends. And she said, oh, Mr. Jefferson, he says he's probably not going to live above a dozen years, and he's going to lose one of those in hairdressing. And she said he's threatening to crop his hair, but he didn't. I can't find any evidence he actually became a crop head until 1804, and that was probably pretty political as well. But at this point, he is having his hair dressed, styled, but very much in more of the French manner, and very heavily powdered. So kind of moving from the head down, of course, a very elaborate ruffle jabot there. But what I really want to talk about a little bit more is the coat he's wearing. And that this coat was not the formal coat he would have worn at court. This was not a court suit, the habillé as they called it in France. And I don't know, I hope everyone with us can see that you can perhaps tell it has a turned down collar, but this coat was called a frock coat. And it had rather low beginnings. It didn't follow the usual trickle down theory of fashion, in that the country workmen in England, they wore what they called a frock or a frock coat. It was usually cut after the style of the fashionable coat, 18th century coat, but a little bit more loose in the body, very substantial fabrics, usually of a little more serviceable, not a lot of service trim. And it had this distinctive turn down collar, which you can see could be very useful if you need kind of a, muffler up around your face, bad weather. And this was just a very serviceable coat. But the English gentry, spending a lot of time on their country estates, began to pick up this coat and use it often for sporting events. It became very popular among the country gentry, and then it kind of makes its way into London. And so finally then it's beginning to be a little more accepted at a little more formal events. Then it jumps the channel and goes to England. Even Nabby Adams, Abigail Adams and John Adams' daughter, when they were still in Paris, she said, oh, I see the beaux here trying very much to copy the English style. And so this coat then began to be picked up in Paris. So it was considered more informal. A little more like maybe a sport coat compared to a formal tailcoat or something of that sort. So it's not what Jefferson would have worn to court. But he even made reference to this coat. And for Jefferson to talk about clothing, that's pretty rare. So I pounced upon that quote, but he said that this frock coat was gaining popularity. He said, of course, the court, he said it's going to some very significant dinner parties, but he said the court, they're not going to accept it. He said that is the last place there's going to be any leveling. So he uses the term leveling in connection with this coat. I found a citation in a journal by Lord Glenbervie where he is writing, and he says, oh, these frock coats, you're seeing them now at every fine dinner party. He wasn't too complimentary. And he said that he was a little uneasy with it because he said, I think it's engendering some leveling and equalizing notions. So there was a political connotation to this coat. It was dressing down. And so I think it interesting that Jefferson could have had his portrait painted in his finest court apparel, showing the position he was in, the office he was holding, but he didn't. He does look very elegant, very European, but he is in a daytime, everyday coat. So that's a little on the clothes. Now, one other thing I really want to point out in this portrait before we move on from it is the figure that's standing there behind Jefferson, you can see over his shoulder. And this was a figure that became very important in the American Revolution. The French Revolution has kind of a long history. She was called Libertas, or we could call her Miss Liberty, but she was always a female figure, recognizable by the antique garb. But what is important is what she's holding. She's holding a staff, and I don't know if you can tell, right up in the corner, there is on that staff what was called the Liberty Cap. Now, the significance of this went back to a Roman ritual, actually. That's when a Roman slave was about to be liberated, about to be freed, would kneel, would be touched on either shoulder with a staff, and then presented with the Liberty Cap. So needless to say, during the American Revolution, sometimes you see the full image of Libertas, the full figure, but sometimes you'd only see the staff and the cap. But that was very significant. And especially in the French Revolution, the Liberty Cap became very important. So we see Jefferson looking very European, but then he's choosing a daytime coat. And now, did Mather Brown choose to put Libertas in the background? Did they confer on this? I really don't know on that, but it was very significant that Liberty is standing there behind him and over his shoulder. So I think it's an important point in this particular portrait.
That's great. And this was in the Adams family, or where was this displayed afterwards?
This particular one was in the Adams family. Now, a little bit on that. When the portraits were finished, he had to wait a while to get the portraits. He was getting a little nervous because the Adams family were going back to the United States, and he really wanted to he was eager to get the portraits. But he starts to hear from colleagues in London, and then even when the portraits finally get to Paris, people that knew him well said, you know, this isn't a very good likeness. This doesn't look like you. So Jefferson never then mentions this portrait again. And I can find no evidence, we can't find any evidence that it traveled back to the United States with him. Did it? Did he? Certainly when it gets to his catalog of 1815, this portrait is not there. It's not mentioned. So it's a bit of a mystery as what happened to Jefferson's Mather Brown of himself. But Adams also ordered a copy of the Mather Brown of Jefferson, and he also then got a copy of the one that Brown painted of him. So these two portraits then came down through the Adams family, and it was this one then that one of the Adams descendants then contributed to the National Portrait Gallery. And so that's where you can see it today. And I asked to put this slide in because, excuse me, another very important image of Jefferson that came from Paris, and that is the Hutong bust portrait. And I thought here I'd put it in because you can see, I was talking went on about that turned down collar, but I think you can see here a little bit more the structure of that coat, and that it did have the turned down collar. But then the Hutong portrait was considered to be a very good likeness of Jefferson. And so, of course, this is what appeared on his presidential medals with a little augmentation. It's been on our nickel. And so this was more the lasting image of Jefferson. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to his copy of the Mather Brown.
Yeah, no, that's, and you know, I just to plug the American Philosophical Society, we have a Hutong bust here in our vaults. Mm-hmm. And, you know, looking at them in comparison, they do have, are very different depictions of Jefferson. Could you tell us a little bit more about the creation of this bust, the work that Hutong had to do, what Jefferson had to do for a sitter, when it was done? And, you know, is Jefferson in this projecting anything different from what he was doing when he sat for Mather Brown?
I don't know that he was trying to, the dress is very much the same. The styling of the hair, very much the same. But he had negotiated with Hutong when he first got to Paris, in that he had been charged by the state of Virginia. They wanted a full standing portrait of George Washington. They wanted a bust portrait of Lafayette, and this was for the Capitol in Richmond. And so he had shopped around, and then this name of Hutong, this is the guy you've got to have. Hutong even made the trip, actually he was on the same ship going back with Benjamin Franklin, made the trip to the United States. He took Washington's portrait then, made the cast for it at Mount Vernon. And then he didn't do Jefferson's until 1789. This was the last, right before Jefferson was coming back to the United States, or that's when it was, let me say, that's when it was first displayed in the Salon in Paris. But Jefferson in his later years wrote a little bit about this portrait, and to tell us that, that Hutong did make a life cast, as we don't know he sometimes did, but he talked about when he went into Hutong's studio to have his bust portrait made, how little Madame Hutong had anointed him with olive oil on his face and shoulders, while Monsieur Hutong stood aside watching and stirring the plaster that he was about to put on his face and shoulders. So we do know from that apparently Hutong did make a life cast and then made this sculpted portrait from that. It was shown in the Paris Salon in the summer of 1789. Now see, Jefferson is already preparing to leave to come back to the United States, but it got some good reviews. Some felt that it was very like, Monsieur Jefferson, and it showed his witty character. Now, I don't know that we necessarily see a witty character coming forward there, but that was some of the reviews of the Salon, what was said about this bust portrait. But it was considered a very good likeness of Jefferson. We know that he brought a copy back, and we think he probably brought a couple back, and then one of them, of course, wound up with the American Philosophical Society. So another reason I wanted to put this one in, it's been a very important image of Jefferson.
Thank you. And there's actually a question from John Friedman about the Hutong bust, but I think applies more generally to the work that you've done, and that's, did Jefferson ever write about the experience for sitting for Hutong? But more than that, did he ever write about the experience of being painted, what it meant, how he thought about it, the experience of working with an artist? And we've now switched to Gilbert Stuart of Jefferson as president. But before we get to that one, I didn't know if you could talk a little bit more about what you've been able to uncover and excavate about Jefferson and what he's written about all these experiences.
Unfortunately, he didn't, and that's very disappointing, because it may appear like the first time he sat to Gilbert Stuart was in 1800 in Philadelphia, and he actually commissioned that portrait himself. But there's a lot of speculation on it, because we don't think he ever actually received that portrait. But all he does, he puts in his accounting records, set to Stuart, paid $100. And that's all he says. And so he doesn't really talk about the experience, and we could wish so much that he did. But now Stuart tells us that he was, when Jefferson was president, he says that he was entertained at a dinner, was invited to one of the dinners at the president's house, the White House, of course, today. So by little bits and pieces, we may put this together, but unfortunately, Jefferson did not write about sitting for his portrait. I wish I could tell you more there, but I have not been able to uncover much on that at all, how he felt about it. And he did not commission many portraits of himself. The one to Mather Brown, so was that for his collection in Paris? Then he did commission a portrait from Gilbert Stuart, and then he eventually commissioned a second portrait from Gilbert Stuart. And those are the only ones that he commissioned himself. The portrait you're seeing here by Gilbert Stuart, and this is the closest we have to what would be called a state portrait. In other words, a very official state portrait of Jefferson. But this was not commissioned by him. It was commissioned by a man named James Bowdoin III. And he was the founder of Bowdoin College, so you may link him up there. But the reason he wanted this portrait is that in 1804, he had been appointed by Jefferson to be our minister plenipotentiary to the court in Spain, in Madrid. And this was a rather nice assignment. And it was coming in a rather ticklish time, and Bowdoin must have known this, and that this, of course, was shortly after the purchase of Louisiana. And Jefferson, he's kind of trying to bully Spain in a sense, in that he felt that within the negotiation in the Louisiana Purchase Treaty, we not only got New Orleans and of course the undisputed use of the Mississippi River, but he says that we got Western Florida as well. He wanted the Floridas, then they called it East Florida, which is what we think of as much of Florida today. But then West Florida was kind of that panhandle that came on out over across the Gulf Coast. And he really wanted that area. He saw it as very important economically for security. And he especially wanted up to like Mobile Bay. And so he was trying to kind of to say, oh no, we bought this. Spain is saying, it had been retroceded back to us from France. Napoleon is staying very quiet about it all. He doesn't get into it. And so it was a very tense time between the United States and Spain. And so Jefferson is appointing Bowdoin then to go to Madrid and be our minister. So with that knowledge, Bowdoin immediately commissions a portrait of Thomas Jefferson as president and a portrait of James Madison as our Secretary of State. If at all possible, he wants it done by Gilbert Stuart, who was the leading American portrait artist at the time. And he wants it half length. He gives a lot of detail. He says where he wants it shipped in Spain. And I think Bowdoin, he was enough of an international figure, a collector of art himself, that he had to know, getting back to what these portraits signified. If you're going as a diplomat into this foreign country, an 18th century, early 19th century diplomat, you are the voice of the ruler, the monarch, the king, whoever, the prince. You are the ruler's voice and standing in for him. But very often they would take a very formal portrait of the prince himself, so that therefore you have this visual image. And that why Jefferson wanted George Washington when he was ready to leave for Paris. We didn't have a president under the Articles of Confederation, but, you know, to use a very hackneyed phrase, I mean, of course, Washington was the rock star. I mean, and then very quickly he got Benjamin Franklin there too. So it was important to have these very formal images of whoever was the designated ruler. Now, I can't find where Bowdoin wrote this down, but I have to wonder, by him wanting a portrait of not only the president, but also of the Secretary of State, is he saying to a European audience, okay, we don't have just a king, we have a government, we have an executive office. There's more than just one person leading the country. It is a democratic institution that we're working under. So this was the story behind the portrait of why he commissioned, why Bowdoin wanted the portrait. Actually finish the story very quickly, and then we want to talk a little bit more about the portrait itself. But unfortunately, it didn't make it to Madrid to get tested before this European audience to see how they reacted, because Bowdoin became very ill on the voyage over. He did reach the coast of Spain, but immediately took the ship to London to see doctors there. So the portrait, unfortunately, it never left fortunately, never left the United States. The portraits of Jefferson and Madison, they were in Bowdoin's home in Boston, where he then eventually, when he comes back, he adds them to his own collection. They then are now in Bowdoin College and the art museum there. But that was the intent and the purpose of the portrait. And so it is the closest we have as a state portrait to Jefferson. So here he sits in his very formal black suit.
And what I found so interesting in your book was a connection I had not made, I'm a little embarrassed to say, but is how similar it is to another state portrait done also by Stuart. I mean, even the column in the background.
Right.
If you could talk a little bit more about these two portraits in conversation.
First off, the black suit. Now, it was becoming a real fashion item in Europe, really picked up in this country, and I feel one reason is because it became Washington's uniform. Once he began to wear the black belt, he had black silk velvet suits, and this really became his signature look. Jefferson, the others, they also accepted, like I say, it was the growing tide of fashion, but Jefferson accepted it as well for his presidential office. Now he toned it down a little. If we look at these portraits together here, Washington's, of course, is full length. Bowdoin had only requested a half length. But if you can look carefully, and I know this is going to be hard to see in the slide, but on the front ruffle to the shirt called the jabot, Washington you always see in a very fine lace. You see some lace at his wrists. Jefferson didn't do that. Once he left, now he had to wear the lace when he was in Paris for his diplomatic garb, but once he comes back, even as president, just a simple little linen ruffle. Hey, that's fine. Let's tone it down a bit. His hair is not quite, it is powdered, but not quite as formally dressed as Washington's. Another little accessory item that he doesn't have here is Washington, if you can, he's gesturing with one hand, that oratorical gesture that was very popular at this point, the grand manner style. But in the other hand, he's holding a dress sword. And that was very much the mark, the emblem of a gentleman. When Jefferson was in Paris, he had to have a gentleman's dress sword. The dress sword, the formal hat, those were two things, and the lace. Those were three things that were a part of the dress code he had to have. So he kind of does away with those when he gets back to the United States. So you can also see Washington's very elegant hat there on that table behind him with the big black cockade. You don't see that on the table with Jefferson, and he is not carrying the dress sword. So subtle. Still, Stuart's putting him very much in that grand manner style that you see the column, you see the billowing red drapery and some very fine red upholstered furniture, but he didn't put quite as much detail in this painting. I think he was a little more hurried, but I mean, Washington was where Stuart really made his mark. And of course, there is a lot of detail in that, to the furniture, to the items on the desk. Jefferson's, you see a few books, but it's not quite as elaborate in detail but then it's a half length, it's not a full length portrait. So that does make a difference there. But definitely that style of the black suit, that was set by Washington.
And do you think Jefferson knew that he was in conversation? This he was painted by Stuart. Was he aware of this portrait of Washington? And when he sat, do you think he had this other portrait in his mind, or was it not as widely known as it is today?
Oh no, it was very widely known. Stuart did a number of copies of this in full length. So it became a well-known image. But one reason it became so well-known, it was in almost every American household. It was a British engraver, the name of Heath, who then actually, when this portrait was actually, it was called the Lansdowne because it was commissioned by Bingham, Philadelphia merchant. I don't know if you need all this detail, but it was a gift to Lord Lansdowne, who had been very supportive of the American cause. And so it had made its way to England, and Heath then made prints of it. And to Stuart's fury, because he said he planned to make prints, because that's where you could make some money, because you sold them only for $1, $2 if they were framed. It wasn't a lot, but a lot could be sold. And so from some of the ads I've seen and some of the remarks that I've read, I do believe that a lot of American households, they may not have had the painted version, but they at least had the little black and white engraving that had been made by Heath. So this image of Washington was extremely well known. And there's a very good chance that somewhere Jefferson had seen one of the Stuart copies of Washington, because there were several. So now, did Jefferson really have this portrait in mind, or this is what Stuart knew that Bowdoin needed to take with him as a diplomatic portrait as he journeyed to Spain? That's a little hard to say, because again, Jefferson doesn't write about it. Stuart did make a few remarks about his relationship with Mr. Jefferson, and I think it was cordial. He said we were political differences, but he liked the man himself pretty well.
Thank you. So now your book doesn't look just at portraits, it looks at a variety of different images of Jefferson, and images of Jefferson that he didn't even know about or necessarily approve of, such as the philosophic cock, which is a political cartoon published, I believe, in 1804 by James Aitken. This your reading of this was, it was so complex because there's so much going on in this image. And I'm mindful of the time that we have questions coming in. But the thing that I was most struck by, as at the APS, I think the reference to philosophy, the philosopher president. That was one of the barbs the Federalists threw at Jefferson. He was, two in his mind. And throughout his presidency, he was also the president of the APS. But it's the other image that I didn't know if you could talk a little bit more about that is standing next to Jefferson, who that person is, and what that tells you about what people knew and talked about in the time of Jefferson and the things that were forgotten for a while.
Well, we interpret this and we think pretty surely that the little hen there looking up at the philosophic cock is supposed to represent Sally Hemings. Now, she's not labeled in the portrait, but by 1804, this was something that had been in print. And it was actually James Callender, who was a journalist that was working out of Richmond when he wrote this story of Jefferson, and he kind of had a falling out with Jefferson, a little disgruntled, but he wrote the story in 1802 about Jefferson and his enslaved concubine, Sally. He went on to describe how it was Sally that he had taken with him to France to be a maid for his daughters. Now, he got that a little wrong. Jefferson didn't take Sally Hemings to Paris. He took her brother James, but then see, the youngest daughter didn't go with Jefferson initially. It was only the eldest daughter, Martha. But then when he had the youngest daughter sent to him, then she needed an escort, maid with her, an escort, and then that was when Sally Hemings came, and he didn't really know she was coming. But we do accept that it was in Paris that the liaison began between the two. Now, what Callender wrote, and this is the journalist, not the one that's doing the image here, but what Callender wrote was what he was trying to make a point of, is he said that here is, truthfully, it didn't seem to bother him as much that Jefferson had an enslaved concubine, is the fact that he was flaunting her here before and had her here with his daughters. And what does that say about this man's character? That he will flaunt his concubine before his family, and then of course took her back to Monticello. So the story of Black Sal, his enslaved concubine, had already begun to circulate. How widespread, we don't know for sure, but it had been in print. And then obviously this is what Aiken is pointing to. And so of course what enthralls me about this caricature, this political caricature, is this image that is supposedly representing Sally Hemings. But what I can't find any evidence that Aiken was ever at Monticello. Now, if somebody could come up with something, it would be wonderful to think, did he actually see her? I couldn't connect it, could not connect it. But he does show a rather attractive face there. The turban, of course, it was very much a fashion item among women then, but also then something that, of course, was associated with the African-American women. And so obviously that is who he is referring to, is to the African Venus, Black Sal, Sally. These were the names that were sometimes put to her. I don't think some of them too flattering. But I was intrigued by, of course, the little hen here as she's looking up at the philosophic cock. But as you kind of alluded to, there's a duality going on in this caricature that is, yes, it's the liaison between Jefferson and his enslaved concubine, but also his liaison with France. And quite honestly, at that time, that would have as upset as many people as probably that he had an enslaved concubine. And I know that that's hard for us to accept today, but it's quite possibly. I keep finding things that make me feel that way over and over. But because a lot of people were very nervous about Jefferson's relationship with France. And of course, now it's Napoleonic France. And he wasn't too fond of Napoleon, but he was quite a supporter of the French idea that the sister republic, this kind of thing. And he always, in foreign affairs, favored France over London. And so there he is. And oh, and I failed to mention, the cock, of course, is the emblem of revolutionary France. Remember when Notre Dame burned, not too far in our past here, and remember when the big steeple came crashing down and the cock that was on top of the steeple, but it was very much the emblem then of revolutionary France. And of course, the philosophic hawk, because as you mentioned, and I didn't go into it when we were looking at the Mather Brown, but one thing he was also dressing for, and when he was in Paris, was to be a part of those circles of literati. He so much wanted to be a part of the intellectual circles in Paris. And he was very proud of that. And of course, he's elected president of the American Philosophical Society once he returns, but politically it was used against him because the idea was, and what a lot of the Federalists would question, okay, we've questioned his character of having this slave concubine, but also this philosophe, this allied with France. I mean, can you really trust this intellectual to really be able to, and what this is one of the references I've seen, kind of someone of the intelligentsia, this philosophe, can they really hold the helm of state steady if we should hit a crisis? Oh no, one went on to say, oh no, we need a leader like the great Washington. You can't trust an intellectual in the president's office. No, no, no. They're going to be, it wasn't the image that some felt should be there. So that is the other thing that Aiken is pointing out here. So he's kind of has a dual thing going within this particular caricature, and not particularly flattering, of course, to Jefferson. This was an opposition party kind of propaganda piece that we have.
It's fascinating. I have so many other questions I'd love to ask you, but I know that we're running short on time, and we have to get to the one that I've been waiting for. This is for those that have never been able to visit the APS in person, this is a Thomas Sully. It's the final image of Jefferson painted while he was in retirement. And it sits in Franklin Hall for all to see when we have public events like this one in person. So Gaye, I don't know if you could tell us a little bit more about the story behind this image and what Jefferson is trying to tell us in this image.
Okay, a little bit of the backstory here, because it was commissioned as a memorial, and those were the words used. It was in January of 1821. Jefferson's now 78 years old, or going to be 78 in April, I think. And he receives a letter from Jared Mansfield, a professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. And Professor Mansfield says that I am writing on behalf of the other professors, the officers, the cadets here at the Military Academy. Here's what we want. We want a memorial of your person that can descend to posterity. That's what we want. Now, here's why we want it. We want it because you were a patron of the nation, but you were the patron also of the Military Academy. Because, see, it was in March of 1802 that Jefferson, as president, signed the congressional bill that created the United States Military Academy at West Point. And he really had pushed this idea, not just that he signed on the dotted line, he very much supported having this educational establishment at West Point. And of course, it was a military academy, but he had pushed for it very, very much. And so they wanted this as, and they say, as a memorial, to your person, but for what you've done, for your support of the founding of the nation and of the U.S. Military Academy. So I think that's important to know when we're thinking about memorials. What was the motive here? Why did they want it? What was the purpose to be? And it was a rather detailed, it was a short letter, but Mansfield goes on to say, he says that we're going to put it in the academic library. It's going to hang alongside a portrait we already have of the great Washington. And it's also going to hang between the great Washington and Jonathan Williams, who had been the first superintendent of the Military Academy appointed by Jefferson. And so Sully comes to, and we've already hired this young artist, Thomas Sully, just tell us when he can come, is pretty much what they said. So Sully arrives at Monticello in March of 1821, and he's there for 12 days. He said he left reluctantly. Apparently the two really hit it off well. But again, Jefferson does not write about what it was like sitting to Sully. But while he is at Monticello, that's where he actually takes this portrait. So this is the one that was taken from life. Then, if you want to go into that next slide, I'm sure he made some studies. Now, when this one was made, whether it was actually at Monticello, not until he gets back to his studio, I'm not sure. This is a little study, just a quick oil on paper that Sully did. but for the full, oh, because West Point had said, we want a full length. It was not just to be a bust portrait, it was to be a full length. But he takes the bust portrait from life at Monticello. He starts making studies. And this one is still extant at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I think it's very interesting because obviously Sully is investigating this idea or kicking around this idea of having Jefferson outdoors. If you can tell, there's a crowd of people there in the background, more figures there behind him. He's holding a piece of paper. Maybe is he about to make a speech? Maybe announce the founding of the military academy? We don't know for sure, but obviously he is wearing the same clothing, and I didn't go too much into that, but he's obviously wearing this fur-lined coat, which we saw just in the bust portrait. So we know it was somehow associated with that. So obviously it was the thought he had that Sully maybe was playing with. But if you want to go on to the next one, the next slide, but this is what he ultimately comes up with for the military academy. This is the portrait that's extant today. And it is at West Point in the library. At the academy, and it's quite a grand portrait, but this was the final version that Sully came up with. And let me point out just a few things in it. Okay, he's moved the figure of Jefferson inside. He's now all alone. He's standing there in a very kind of theatrical pose. Sully was from a theatrical family, but he became an artist instead of an actor. And I want to say, I'll just remark briefly upon this coat, although I could go on and on about it. According to family tradition, Jefferson had a sable-lined coat that had belonged to Thaddeus Kosciuszko, and that may not be a household name, but he was a Polish aristocrat that he was very helpful and instrumental in the American Revolution. He came over, he was a military engineer. And so he applied his skills at West Point and fortifying West Point and ensuring that the British were not going to get their ships up the Hudson River. He's still commemorated at West Point. We're talking about memorials. There is a very fine statue there, an outdoor statue on the grounds of Kosciuszko. The Kosciuszko Gardens are still there. So I don't know because Jefferson didn't write about it, but if he had this coat, and we know from family members, he did have this coat, did come to him from Kosciuszko. If it's hanging there in his closet, would this be a time to pull it out? He's got on the old black suit again. And by the way, it is a style that goes back to 1802. It's nothing like they would have been wearing in 1821, although he wasn't the most fashionably inclined in his retirement years. But I wonder if that's one reason that the coat was the connection. Now, who was going to recognize this? Although they might recognize that it was a coat of more Eastern European style. That someone might pick up on, maybe then somehow linked to Kosciuszko. But what it does for Sully is it makes his figure more substantial. It's also echoing the lines of the column that he's standing next to. Now, how many times have we seen this column now? But this is a very specific column. So very quickly, I want to point out a little about it. That the brush marks that Sully uses here indicates to us that this is Brescia marble. It was what, okay, you know, the White House, the Capitol had burned during the War of 1812. They were now in the process of rebuilding. They were rebuilding the House of Representatives. And instead of the sandstone columns that had been there before, Latrobe, who was the architect at that time, decides to put in this Brescia marble. And if you follow the light, Sully was so clever with a light from the face down to that document, and we don't know what the document is, but down to the base of that column that you see, if you can tell, it was a water leaf design, and it was a cincture that was put around the base of the Brescia marble between it and the base itself. And it was very indicative of, well, it told us Sully placed Jefferson in the House of Representatives. So it's very interesting. He moves him from an outdoor crowd scene. He puts him as this lone figure in the House because that is very much, Jefferson felt that, of course, he believed in the balance of powers, that the powers should be mostly in Congress, but he really felt that the House was much more the voice of the people, and that's the way he regarded it. Now, he never saw the room, he was never there, but I think it's very interesting that this is where Sully chooses to place the figure in his final version that's going to West Point.
Great, thank you. And I want to end with one last question before we turn it over to the audience. And again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We've got a number of them coming in, but please ask your questions. So my final one, this is For those that have never visited the APS, this is Franklin Hall. This is the stage in which Gaye and I would have been sitting on having this conversation. And behind us would have been a Stuart of Washington, a Peel of Franklin, and then the Sully of Jefferson. And in this moment, you were talking a lot about memorials and about ways in which people are talking about how public space what type of items should be in public space, what type of images, and how these images should be interpreted, and the context in which we should treat them and think about them and describe them. So given all that's been going on in the world with discussions about statues and memorials and your own work on Jefferson, especially this final portrait, which was created as a memorial, how do you think institutions like the APS or us as a society thinking about our public squares and monuments should think about this type of imagery in history?
I have been giving that some thought as I was working on preparing this for tonight, and it's a very emotional question for us right now, and I think it's a very difficult question. Of course, I work more with the painted portrait more than the large public statuary, so I can speak to that a little more. But I think what I thought as I was working on this, like just taking the Sully that's here, that there was, okay, Mansfield, he gave the reason. Yes, we want this as a memorial to your person, Thomas Jefferson, but here's why we want it. We want it because you helped allowed this military academy to exist. It was with your support, your patronage. You also gave that support to the founding of this nation. So I think if we start to think about why was this memorial put there? What was the real true purpose? Because from what I'm reading, a lot that's going on and a lot of the controversy, I think that's one question we can ask. Who is the image? What is the image of? But why was that image there? What was it meant to say? And I think there can lie the crux of it, whether it's a painted portrait, as we see here, or whether it is in some equestrian statue out in a public square. But of course, once you get into the open public spaces, because again, Jared Mansfield said, this is going to hang in the academic library. And that's where the West Point portrait still is today. This is in your Franklin Hall. It's not in a space that people have to walk by it every day. They have to drive by it every day. That the environment is different. But then I think, again, I come back to looking at the purpose, getting down to the purpose, because I think that's where we run into some funny things when we start looking at some of this statuary and start asking questions. So right. Not a deep answer, but that was some of my thoughts as I was working on this and thinking about these memorials.
No, thank you. And the questions are flooding in, and I think we'll only be able to get to some of them, but those that we don't get to, we will be able to post this video online. And with these unanswered questions, Gaye may be able to respond to some of them online. So the first question I want to ask you comes from our own Mellon Curatorial Fellow, Janine Bolt, who is an art historian herself who studied 18th century portraiture in Virginia. And her question is, can you say more about how different audiences responded to the portraits of Jefferson? And I think it's coming in his own time. For example, did Federalists and Republicans respond to any of his portraits differently? Is there any evidence that certain portraits actively shaped his public images or were more widely circulated than others?
Mm-hmm. That is always something I was seeking when I was working on this project, is trying to get some contemporary feedback of, well, what did you see when you looked at this? I mean, we look at it today and we may see Thomas Jefferson, but what were they seeing then? And it's very difficult. Again, I'll go back to the Hutong was probably one that was a little more widespread because it appeared on some medals and it was kind of the presidential medal. So that might have been spread a little bit more. The best account I found comes back to the Sully that we were just talking about, in that apparently when it was, first off, when Sully he's got it ready, 1822, he's got it ready, framed, it's ready to go to be shipped to the West Point. But he has what he calls, and I was looking again at some of my notes from his journal today, he says, I held my Jefferson exhibition, and he said, made $30 off of it. And so I'm kind of guessing, very often Peel, Sully, they would charge you like 25 cents a piece if you want to come into the gallery and see a specific show, something that was very specific that way. So maybe like in Philadelphia, 120 people could have come and paid to see the portrait out of curiosity, whatever. Then it goes on up to West Point. Apparently, it was fairly well received there. Now, as I said, it hung in the academic library. It's not out in the town square, but in the academic library. But apparently, this was semi-public, that people could come in to see it. Because then by 1823, it was kind of being labeled as, oh, well, if you're at the Point, well, this is a must-see. You've got to come see this new portrait of Thomas Jefferson. So one of the viewers in 1823 was James Fenimore Cooper. And you probably know him as an early American novelist and writer. He was also a very high Federalist. He did not like Jefferson. He did not like one thing about Jefferson or his politics. And in fact, when he wrote this account of it, he said, I would have gone almost twice as far to see the portrait of any other man, but I was told I really needed to see this portrait. His traveling companion looked at it and said, no, this is a fine portrait. This is really very good. So then he finally writes and he says, you know, I may not still agree with Jefferson's politics, but when I saw him standing there, there was a certain elegance, a certain, I don't remember now if he used the term nobility to it, but he said, I really came to respect the man himself, or to see him differently. And whenever I think of him now in my mind's eye, I see him in those that, he said, the very simple robes of Sully, was talking about that elegant coat, but it did change his view somewhat of Jefferson. So that is one of the best instances I know of, that someone, because this was a writer, that he's seeing this and he's really writing down, here's what I saw, here's how I felt about it. And it's so hard to get that. The family liked Gilbert Stuart the best, but that was within the family household and it wasn't really that much of a public portrait. So that's a little snippet of what I've been able to find, but it's always a challenge to find what did the contemporary people, what did they really think of it? What did they see?
There are a number of questions that are very similar, and it's more about how an art historian does their work. And so the questions, if I could try and distill them into one, is you know, your reading of these portraits is so fine and detailed, and you're able to uncover for all of us all the things we should be seeing in it. And you know, one of the questions is, you know, how carefully did Thomas Jefferson think about what he was putting on, whether it was buckles, whether it was the coat, you know, and you know, how about Stuart's role, the painter's role, in adding things like the column to the House of Representatives? You know, would that have been done theoretically in conversation with Jefferson, or would that have been Sully doing that on his own? And it was Sully, not Stuart, you know, when he was painting the final likeness. So, you know, as an art historian, how do you, if you could talk about your method in approaching and interpreting art?
Well, it does take a lot of looking at it and a lot of study and trying to read every contemporary account you can find that might relate to it, that might tell you something about it. Looking at, you know, correspondence, various things that way. And of course, I'm really more of a clothing historian than an art historian, but you've got to study the art in order to really get a sense, the overall sense of the history of clothing and of dress. So I look a lot at then the entire figure. That's why I like portraits. I like to look at the entire figure within it and how they were grooming themselves. Now, the posture, that's always the fine line. We don't know how much of it the artist is adding to this, and then how much the sitter. Now, one rule of thumb I go by is a good friend and colleague, Ellen Miles, who was a curator at the National Portrait Gallery. She said, okay, you always look at, you know, where's the money? Who's paying for this commission? Because they often then had a lot of say in how they wanted the final product to look. I would wonder if Jefferson didn't have some influence there in even when he wasn't commissioning it. Now, like in the Sully, once I do think, according to some of the evidence that's left, that when Sully was at Monticello for those 12 days, they obviously talked some about architecture, because Sully then had promised Jefferson he was going to send him this French book on architecture when he got back. At that point, his studio was in Baltimore, but he couldn't find the book. Jefferson writes and says, "Oh, thank you very much, but don't worry. I'm sending right now an order off to Paris. I'll see if I can't get it that way." And he actually did put that book in the library at the University of Virginia. So it was a book on architecture, French architecture. And also then when Sully was at Monticello, Jefferson sent him down to see the buildings that were under construction at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He didn't go himself. So it was a little hard for him to go. So he didn't go himself. So he writes a note and says, "This is Thomas Sully, the prominent portrait painter, and show him the buildings, and I'm going to want a full report when he gets back. So make sure that you show them well." So now those little snippets say to me, they talked architecture. So then I'm assuming that Sully may have made that final decision on placing Jefferson in the House of Representatives, possibly. I don't know of any correspondence where he wrote back and said, "Hey, Mr. Jefferson, how about if I put you in?" No. But I think he knew the architecture was important to Jefferson. I'm assuming maybe through conversation, he knew that the House of Representatives was important in Jefferson's thinking about a democratic society and who really had the voice of the people. And so that I'm wondering how much then that could have influenced Sully. So and sometimes it becomes just serendipity, when you find something or think you found something, but it's looking at a lot of different things and putting a lot of little bits and pieces together. And as I say, in portraiture, I like to look at the full image and if there's any correspondence between the sitter and the artist, but very little, that little wee bit between Jefferson and Sully.
Great. And we have so many questions, but we've gone long. I have one last question, which is coming from a friend of the APS, Jay Stiefel, who wants to know if you know the story of how the APS got the Sully portrait of Jefferson.
Absolutely, and I meant to include that. I'm sorry I didn't. Okay, it was donated to APS by a man named William Short in 1830, and he purchased it, and this is in the record, he purchased it directly from Sully. So Sully still had that original. He had kept it so he could make copies. There are several copies of this. We have one at Monticello that is a copy by Sully of the same portrait you have in Franklin Hall. And so Sully still had the original, so he could make some copies. He never made prints though, but Sully wasn't as much of a printmaker. But anyway, he quickly put the final touches to it. He sells it to William Short. Now, William Short, his association with Jefferson, he was very much a Jefferson protege as a young man. He had followed Jefferson to Paris. He served there as his secretary in the American legation. When Jefferson comes back to the United States, he takes over as chargé. So he and Jefferson remained in close contact. Jefferson tried to lure him to Albemarle and buy some land next to Monticello, which he did, but he never built there and settled there. But the two were very close. And of course, as you said, Jefferson then was the president of the Philosophical Society for a number of years, was it 14, 17 years, something like this. And so it was following Jefferson's death that he purchased this, and he purchases and presents it to the Philosophical Society, again, as a memorial to Jefferson and his long tenure there with the Philosophical Society. So I meant to mention that earlier, but that's how it wound up there in Franklin Hall on the block.
Great. And I hope that both you, but all of those who have been tuning in for the past hour or so will be able to see it in person eventually.
Absolutely.
But until then, thank you so much, Gaye, for this stimulating conversation. I learned so much both from your book, but also in the course of the past hour. And for all those online, please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, for all of our virtual programming. There's a number of things we're doing, something every week. So please check us out online, and I hope to see you all virtually again sometime soon. Thank you.